Thank you very much for coming. My name is Doug Irwin. I'm a professor in the economics department and co-director of the Political Economy Project. Before we get started, I just want to announce two events upcoming sponsored by the Political Economy Project that may interest you. First of all, this Thursday at 6 p.m. in Rocky 2, Mayor Cohn from the economics department will be speaking on Was There a Malthusian Trap? Somewhat relevant given the Nobel Prize given today for economic growth, reversal of fortune, what have you. So we invite you to come to that. Next Monday at 12:30, an odd time, 12:30 in the afternoon in Rocky 3, we'll be having a conversation with Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, former Treasury Secretary of the U.S., and so you're invited to that as well.
Will lunch be served?
Lunch will not be served. No free lunch, not on PEP. On to this afternoon's event. So it is an election year, and you might recall James Carville's admonition that it's the economy, stupid. And so we're very much focused, of course, on day-to-day fluctuations in the economic indicators that we have, what's the latest with the unemployment rate. But when we focus on those short-term indicators, sometimes we miss the medium-term and the long-term trajectory of the U.S. economy. In particular, whether we are delivering for every subsequent generation the economic benefits that past generations have been accustomed to. The big question, of course, is whether the American dream is still alive. The American dream not necessarily being a small house with a picket fence, but will every subsequent generation do better than the previous generation? That has been true for most of U.S. history, but there are grave questions about whether that's true today. With stagnant incomes, with worries about social mobility, the rising cost of health care, will this be the case for your generation? I'm speaking, of course, to Dartmouth students. Well, to debate this proposition and discuss it further about whether the American dream is still alive and will be alive, we are delighted to bring to campus two splendid, wonderful interlocutors who have written extensively on this subject. First will be David Leonhardt, a senior writer for the New York Times. You might begin your day by reading him. If you get in your email inbox the morning, the flagship daily newsletter of the Times. He started the Times in 1999, and he has served in many positions for that great institution. An economics columnist, Washington bureau chief, founding editor of The Upshot, staff writer for the magazine, and so forth. He is the author, aside from winning a Pulitzer Prize for commentary, is the author of this recent book last year. Ours was The Shining Future, the Story of the American Dream. The Atlantic and the Financial Times called it one of the best books of 2023. It's a wonderful discussion and reporting on the state of the U.S. economy, filled with stories, insights, and much more. We also have Michael Strain, who is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He is an economist by training, and his research and writing span a wide variety of issues, including labor markets, public finance, social policy, and macroeconomics. He was a member of the AEI Brookings Working Group on Poverty and Opportunity, which in 2015 published a very famous and important report, which our class will be reading in part, Opportunity, Responsibility, and Security, a consensus plan for reducing poverty and restoring the American dream. He also teaches at Georgetown University, and he is also the author of a book, The American Dream is Not Dead, which I guess the title gives it away. There's a subtitle, But Populism Could Kill It. We cannot weight the cases for and against by the size of these books, but by the weight of their arguments. So I'll first invite David Leonhardt. Please come to the stage.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you all for coming. I don't think the mic, I think the mic's just for recording, right? Is this mic on? Oh, I'm happy to use the mic. You want me to use the mic? Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for having us. So Michael and I have actually been on tour doing this. We have done this debate online. We've done this debate in Tennessee. We just did it a few weeks ago in Texas. And so I just want to start by saying we're going to disagree with each other, but we really have a good time doing it. And I think Michael and I both feel pretty strongly that what we need more of in our society today is more substantive and respectful disagreement. And so we also welcome that from all of you. During question and answer, if you disagree with something one of us has said, if you want to ask us about something related to the election, feel free to do it. Don't be shy. Question any of our arguments or numbers or anything like that. Part of democracy is disagreement, right? If we didn't disagree with each other, we wouldn't need a democracy. We could just live in an authoritarian state where we all just thought the same thing. So I want to start by making, I think we're each going to talk for 10 minutes, is that right, before we open it up? Let me start a timer on myself. So I want to start by actually defining what the American dream is, because it's obviously a term that, that many of us use, but I think many people don't know what the history of it is. And it's a fascinating history, and I think it's relative to our debate today. As I'll phrase the question, is the American dream alive and well? And the term the American dream comes from a book written in 1931 called The Epic of America by a historian named James Truslow Adams. And if you think for a minute about 1931 and what was going on at the time, it was near the depths of the Great Depression. And yet James Truslow Adams wrote a book that was intended to be a one-volume history of the United States that was profoundly optimistic. In fact, the last line of his book I played off in the title of mine. The last line of his book, quoting an immigrant named Mary Anton, is, "Mine is the shining future." And he basically argued that the United States had a shining future. And he did that in 1931. Herbert Hoover is president. It's been more than 2 years since the stock market has crashed. Things are pretty bad in the United States. But he writes this fundamentally optimistic book in which he defines this new idea called the American dream. If you go and look in newspaper archives before 1931, American and dream sometimes end up next to each other, but it's not the way we think of it now. He coined the phrase, and he defined the American dream as that dream of a better, richer, happier life for all our citizens of every rank, which he said was the greatest contribution that the United States had yet made to the world. So I think it's three things: better, richer, happier life for all our citizens of every rank, that's social mobility, and there's something distinctly American about it. He says it's our greatest contribution to the world. So in my opening remarks, I want to unpack James Truslow Adams' definition and take those three parts: better, richer, happier. I'm going to do it in a slightly different order than he did. And I'm going to start with richer. And Michael and I have now been doing this long enough that we kind of know what each of the other one is going to say. And I actually think the richer part of Michael's argument is his strongest argument. We are richer than the generations that came before us. Our houses are larger than they were. We carry around in our pockets these incredible computers. If you adjust income for inflation, at almost every point in the spectrum, income spectrum, it's at least somewhat higher than it was a couple decades ago or a few decades ago. But there's a really important bit of nuance in this idea of richer, which is the second part of James Truslow Adams' definition. He said a better, richer, happier life for all our citizens of every rank. And when you look at our citizens who are not of the top ranks of society, as ranked by income or education, citizens who are not lucky enough to be sitting in rooms like this one, when you look at the roughly 2/3 of American adults who do not have a four-year college degree, the picture starts to look a lot less pretty. Yes, income growth has been above zero over the last few decades, but that's a pretty low standard to say that income growth has been better than nothing. In fact, whether you look at over the last quarter century, which is roughly the 21st century, or the last 50 years, inflation-adjusted income growth for the bottom half of the income spectrum has been 0.6% a year. That is agonizingly slow. It is about half as fast as income growth has been for the 90th percentile, and much less than half as fast as income growth has been for the 99+ percentile. So what you have for most Americans is some income growth, yes, but it is very slow. They can see other people doing much better, and that breeds frustration, and I think understandable frustration. Here to me is a key fact. For the bottom 99% of the income spectrum, income growth was faster in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s than it has been since the 70s. So let's pause on that. Income growth has slowed down for the bottom 99% of the income spectrum over the last half century. It has slowed down. And that explains a statistic that you may have heard. It comes from a research group led by Raj Chetty at Harvard, which is a child born in this country in 1940 had a 92% chance of growing up to out-earn his or her parents. 92% chance. So even if you experienced a layoff, even if you experienced a divorce, even if you had a health problem, your odds were very good of out-earning your parents. If you were born in 1980, your chance of out-earning your parents is just 50%. It's more like a coin flip of whether you achieve the richer part of James Truslow Adams' definition, better, richer, happier. I've been talking about income here. In some ways, the trends with wealth are even worse. The net worth of a 35 to 44-year-old household led by a 35 to 44-year-old at the start of this century was $86,000. You know what the net worth of a household led by someone that same age today is? Exactly $86,000. No progress. And those kind of things explain why, as you will hear from people a little bit older than you, as you will experience when you go out in the world, things like buying a house, an idea that many people associate very strongly with the American dream, is so much harder for young people today than it was for my generation and certainly for the baby boom generation. So to me, when you look at richer and ask, is the American dream alive and well, the answer is mixed, but it's not particularly positive. When you look at the other two parts of it, better and happier, the picture is even worse. So let's start with happier. The first thing I would say is look around. Does it seem like we're living in a happy country right now? Do your fellow citizens seem like they're just really pleased with the way things are going in this country, and they feel charitable toward their other fellow citizens, and online they're saying nice things about each other, and when you turn on cable TV news at night, people are talking about what a wonderful era this is in American life? No, that's not how it feels in the United States right now. And not only that, but there's a huge amount of polling data to back it up. People are incredibly distrustful of major institutions in American society. Gallup has a long-running poll, do you trust the following institution? The answers to nearly every institution have plummeted over the last few decades. Only 36% of people say they trust higher education. Only 36% of people say they trust the medical system. For organized labor, it's 28%. For organized religion, it's 32%. For banks, it's 27%. For public schools, it's 29%. For newspapers, I'm sorry to say, it's 18%. But when I want to make myself feel better, it's only 16% for big business. It is 12% for TV networks, and it's 9% for Congress. That's not the only polling that shows how frustrated people are. It has been almost 20 years since the majority of Americans said this country was headed in the right direction. 20 years. So that means whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether the economy is growing or shrinking, most Americans do not think our country is headed in the right direction. And then there are the actual questions about the American dream. Pew asked people, is the American dream still possible? Which is a really low bar. Still possible. A slight majority of Americans said it is still possible, but among Americans under the age of 50, only 42% of Americans said the American dream is still possible. And that was the more positive polling about the American dream. When ABC asked people, does the American dream still hold true? 23% of Americans said it still held true, a rapid decline from what the same poll found when they asked about it a couple decades ago. There are also questions about people's personal life. Gallup asked people, are you satisfied with your personal life? Only 47% of Americans describe themselves as very satisfied with their own lives, down from almost 60% in the early 2000s. Go beyond polls. Look at measures of loneliness. Look at measures of mental health. And as I said, just look around and look at the quality of our civic discourse. Does the general sense of life in this country, does our national happiness suggest that the American dream is alive and well? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. And then finally, and most importantly, there's the better part of James Truslow Adams' definition. I think today when many people think of the American dream, they may think of it overwhelmingly in economic terms. But it's worth remembering James Truslow Adams picked 3 words, and only one of them was related to the economy. The other 2 were better and happier, which are related to things that are arguably more important than the economy. And when you ask yourself, is life better today than it was in the past? Obviously, it depends on what the past was. It's certainly better than it was in 1800. I like to think of a few decades at a time, and I like to kind of weigh the two. And so what things are clearly better today than they were in the year 2000 or the year 1975? And I think clearly access to information is better. It's vastly better based on phones and digital technology. I think most forms of discrimination are less bad today than they used to be. Religious discrimination, racial discrimination, gender discrimination. I think crime in most places is lower than it was 40, 50 years ago. I think the air we breathe is cleaner. And I think the access to healthcare, if you're rich, the best healthcare at the top of our system is clearly better. The new example is Ozempic, right, which is clearly a bit of progress. It also costs $12,000 a year, so it's not something that's widely available to mass numbers of Americans. So there are definitely things that have gotten better. There are also things that have gotten worse. The planet is hotter. The kind of storms that Florida and North Carolina and other parts of the country just experienced didn't happen with anywhere near the frequency a few decades ago that they happen today. Gun violence is worse. The percentage of children who are growing up with two parents is much lower than it used to be. The number of Americans who are confident enough in the future to decide to have children, which is in many ways the single biggest bet you can make on the future, to decide to have children, that's plummeted, the sign of people's lack of confidence in the future. I would say that the quality of our democracy is weaker than it was a few decades ago. Ronald Reagan began his first inaugural address in 1981 by talking about the miracle of the peaceful transfer of power. That is not the situation we're living with today. There are other things that I think are also worse. Diabetes is worse in this country than it used to be. Chronic pain is worse than it used to be. And so how you weigh these things of what's better and what's worse is hard. Here's where I come down in the end. I think the single best measure of the quality of life in a country is life expectancy. It's how long do you live. In 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. This is the first chart in my book, and the paperback's coming out next week. You can look it up. The United States had a very normal life expectancy for a rich country in 1980, kind of in the middle of Europe and Japan and Canada and Australia. Our life expectancy since 1980 has grown much more slowly than that of every other rich country in the world. So much so that by the early years of the 2000s, we had the lowest life expectancy of any rich country in the world. Today, we have by far the lowest life expectancy of any rich country in the world. When you look at it on a graph, it's not even close. The life expectancy in the United States is somewhere just south of 78 years old, depending which measure you use. The comparisons are all the same. So if the US is at 78, the United Kingdom is at 81, Germany is at 81, France is at 82, Canada is at more than 82, the entire European Union is at 81.5, Japan is at 84, South Korea is at 83. Even some countries that barely qualify as rich, Poland has a life expectancy of more than 78, greater than the United States of America. I think the fact that as recently as 1980 we were a normal country is really important. There isn't something inherent about the United States as a nation of immigrants or a diverse nation or a big continental nation that means we have a low life expectancy. We were normal until just a few decades ago. And today, for a whole set of reasons, including inequality, including our approach to guns, including our approach to traffic, including our approach to healthcare, we have the lowest life expectancy of any country in the rich world. I don't think that's good enough. And the reason I make this argument is because I think we live in a fantastic country. It's a country that quite literally saved my family's lives. My guess is many of you have stories that are similar to that. And I don't think we should accept the kind of results that we have had in this country, particularly for the roughly 2/3 of Americans who do not have a college degree. And so to me, the argument about whether the American dream is alive and well is fundamentally an argument about what we need to do to live in a better country that produces better lives for so many of our fellow citizens, and that also has the confidence to do things on the world stage that only the United States has shown itself able to do over the last century. Thank you so much.
Now, Michael Strain.
I also will use the microphone. Thank you all for coming. There are many more of you here than when I sat down, which means you're all optimizing. Thank you for the econ major should at least laugh. Thanks for having us so much. It's wonderful to see some friends in the audience. Thank you, David, for doing this again. I just want to strike 2 points of agreement with what David said. The first is that these kinds of disagreements, I think, are crucially important. David made the completely correct point that they are important for a democracy, which of course they are. We're here at one of the great universities in the world, and it strikes me that they're also important for the advancement of civilization. Quite literally, you could construct a very reasonable model of civilization as, one person says, say, I think that all the heavenly bodies revolve around the earth. And someone else says, no, you're wrong, and here's why. And that person who says, no, you're wrong, and here's why, needs to get a hearing and can't be shouted down and can't be told that he's not allowed to present his point of view. And because our civilization has allowed that guy to say, no, I don't agree, we walked on the moon. We have incredible advances in science. We have incredible advances in social science. And especially at a place like Dartmouth, that needs to continue. Dartmouth's holding the torch right now for scientific advancement and the advancement of knowledge and truth. So I'm very happy to be here, particularly at a university. The second point I want to agree with David on is that we should not be satisfied. I am an unapologetic defender of the health of the American dream. I'm also an unapologetic defender of the view that we can do better, we need to do better, and I think we will do better. To say that the American dream is alive and well is not to say mission accomplished. To say that the American dream is alive and well is instead to say we know how to do this. We know how to advance economic outcomes. We know how to create better lives for our children than we have. And that should give us confidence that we can continue to advance the American dream. I think David's excellent remarks indicate that this is a complicated issue and that there are a variety of statistics we can look at. There are a variety of things in addition to statistics we can look at. I'm going to present my view on this. I think we are confusing pockets of problems or short periods of struggle for the typical situation. Yes, if you're addicted to opioids, things are not good. Yes, if you are a 50-year-old guy who didn't graduate from high school, who lives in the Rust Belt, and whose factory just shut down, you have a hard road to walk. Yes, the years following the 2008 financial crisis were very difficult for most workers, over half of workers. But most people are not addicted to opioids. Most people are not the man in the example that I articulated, and we are no longer in the year 2010. When you zoom out from those pockets of problems and from those time periods of struggle, and you ask simple questions about how typical workers and typical households are faring, I think you are left with the conclusion that though we can do better, the American dream is strong. By the numbers, there is no better time in human history to be alive than 2024, and there is no better place in 2024 to be alive than in the United States. Wages for typical workers have never been higher. After adjusting for inflation over the past 2 generations, wages for typical workers have grown by 60%. Over the past 3 decades, they've grown by 43%. We had a hard time in the 70s and 80s. The 70s and 80s were a long time ago. Household income is higher than it's ever been. Over the past 3 decades, middle-income households have seen their incomes increase by 65% after adjusting for inflation, taxes, and transfers. For the bottom 20%, inflation-adjusted post-tax and transfer income has doubled over this period. Wealth has never been higher, and not just wealth at the top. I think an economist would argue that what really matters is consumption. That's really what we care about. And consumption, the picture for consumption has never been better, including for lower income households. In the 1960s, the poverty rate was well above 20%. Using the government's relative poverty measure, it's fallen to 13%. Using an absolute standard, it's fallen to 2%. Only 1 out of every 50 households lives in poverty by that standard. On a consumption basis, poverty is arguably even lower. The rate of violent crime in America has cut in half in the past 3 decades. The United States does have a problem with life expectancy. I think this is one of David's strongest arguments. But as of 2022, life expectancy in the United States is back to rising, and life expectancy is higher in the United States than it is in Europe as a whole. David's emphasis on the future, what we can expect for the future, I think is a strong argument in favor of the health of the American dream. We are the home of astonishing advances in healthcare, astonishing advances in pharmaceutical innovation. The mortality rate from heart disease cut in half over the last half century. We're on the verge of witnessing true marvels in pharmaceuticals. Ozempic is one. Alzheimer's treatments, targeted cancer therapies. Access to information, as David mentioned, has never been stronger. Other things in everyday life, air passenger fatality rates have plummeted over the last 40 years. The average American worker receives much more leisure time, much more paid time off than decades ago. I think these debates, and the last 3 minutes of my remarks are guilty of this, can often kind of sound like contests of dueling statistics. So forget about the statistics for a minute. Who of you who were alive in the 1970s would want to go back and live in the 1970s rather than live today? Who among you who weren't alive in the 1970s would rather go back and live in the 1970s than live today? I would guess no one. That would be particularly true if you're a racial minority. It would be particularly true if you're a woman. David references a number of opinion polls that show that folks aren't happy with how things are going. And I think that that is true. The fact that we are even having this debate and the high standards that the American people hold the United States to, I think is actually evidence that the American dream is alive and well. There is not a room like this in Italy where people are gathered to debate and learn about the health of the Italian dream. Italy is a wonderful country. It's not happening there. It's happening here because we hold ourselves to such high standards. And we hold ourselves to such high standards not randomly, not because we're fanciful, but because we are used to achieving higher standards. We're used to achieving, as a country, stronger growth and economic outcomes. Right now, the two most prominent advocates for the view that the American dream is dying are Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Donald Trump has reached the pinnacle of success for a politician and has accumulated a net worth of a couple $2 billion. Kind of rich hearing about how bad things are from him. J.D. Vance talks about how terrible the possibilities are in this country. His life is evidence that what he is saying is false. Surveys show that people are angry, and that anger has lots of roots. But as David's polling data suggested, when you zero in and ask people about the American dream, they're much more optimistic than when you ask them about the state of the country, the state of the economy, how they're feeling about the direction the country's going. I think people are able to distinguish between these things. If you asked me, are you happy with the state of the country and are you happy with how things are going, I would say no, I'm not. If you ask me, do you think the American dream is alive and well, I would say yes, I do. And I don't think those are inconsistent with each other. Countries have moods just like people, and America is in a bad mood. The American dream is not about a mood. The American dream is about a sense of underlying fundamentals. And I think those fundamentals are strong. It's about more than material outcomes. It's about the implicit moral promises of capitalism. It's about freedom, the freedom to live your own life. And this debate is about some of the most important issues facing the United States, including our very conception of ourselves as a nation. Hard to imagine a better time to be doing it than a few weeks before an election, and a better place to be doing it than at one of America's great universities. So thank you again for coming. I look forward to the rest of the evening.
So we're not going to have a rebuttal period. We're going to go right to Q&A. So think of your questions. I'll start off by posing a question. We want to have you back in 15 years.
Deal.
How will we know who's right? What will you be looking at? You already sort of indicated a little bit life expectancy is a key indicator for you, but what would you be looking at to judge who had the better case?
I hope he's right. Let me just say that.
I think you'd be looking at a lot of the things we're already looking at. You know, it's I think it's hard to say. So, you know, I mean, tie your question to a broader issue, right? You know, post-truth, what's true? You know, I think we all need to be able to agree that 2 + 2 = 4, and we should debate whether 4 is big or small. We should debate whether 4 is, you know, a progress or a setback. You know, I think David and I would agree that if you adjust the wages of non-supervisory workers using the PCE price index and you compute the growth from 1990 to today, you get a number around 43%. I think that's impressive. David thinks that it's not as impressive as I think it is. 15 years from now, you know, that could be true.
Here's a historical way I think about it. I'm old enough to have lived through the 1970s and 80s. I don't really remember the 70s, but I do remember the 80s, when our country really lacked self-confidence, right? And there was a feeling initially that the Soviet Union was potentially passing us by, but by the time I remember it, it was really Germany and Japan, Europe and Japan, passing us by. And then that feeling kind of passed, right? And the 90s were quite triumphalist for a bunch of reasons. And I would I think we would all agree, whether I think it's more rational, Michael thinks it's more irrational, this is not a period of great national confidence for the United States. And so we could look at statistics 15 years from now, and we should, but I would also say, what does it feel like? And I think if the country still feels as unhappy and as anxious and as lacking confidence 15 years from now that it is today, my guess is that that would not be a good sign. Whereas if we follow that path we followed before, and we look back on today and we say, whoa, China had more problems than we thought, and actually we're doing better than we thought, to me that would be a sign that things were going better.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. We'll book the date soon. We're looking for questions, not statements. Professor Whelan.
David, you mentioned in passing family structure,
Yes.
which is both a cause and an effect of everything we're seeing. So if you could both talk about that in the context of your respective views. I know it was featured prominently in the AGAT work report. And then as a second issue, we know that like Moynihan was crucified in the 50s for bringing that up as an issue. What that means for social science. It's something that was so important, became kind of verboten.
Still is.
Yeah, well, Melissa Carney's coming as her book, but just kind of that side issue about the way we treat it something that clearly is so important to American well-being?
So I think one of the things, so the declines in the number of children growing up with two parents are really stark. And before I talk about that, I want to start with something that's really important to say, which is, and this is really hard to do, but I want to simultaneously celebrate the incredible bravery and accomplishments and courage of single parents, and talk about how many single parents raise incredibly successful children and families. And we all know single parents in our families. Maybe we were raised by a single parent. My dad was raised by a single parent. I have a framed picture of my grandmother in my office for a reason. And so I want to start by just really making that very clear. And also saying that for a society's standpoint, having more children grow up with only one parent and fewer grow up with two is not good. And you can hear Melissa Carney come and talk about that here. And I would encourage you all to look at her work. And so I think one of the things that happened in the United States, we live in a country with such a horrible history of racial oppression, and not just a history, but the history of racial oppression in this country is much worse than the present day is, and we still live in a country with enormous racial inequities. And so one of the things that we've seen over the period that I talk about as having been so difficult for so many American workers is trends that started in particularly black communities have spread beyond those communities. And I think the debate over the Moynihan Report was so raw because I think understandably a lot of black Americans felt like they were being blamed for deep problems in their community that were not their fault. And to the folks who said that there was too much focus, particularly on the black family during those decades, I think those folks have been proven right because the problem has spread to every racial group in the United States, and it makes clear that the things driving these things, although of course they're related to race because of the amount of racial inequity we have in our society, they're fundamentally not a racial story. And you now see the number of kids growing up with only one parent having really grown very rapidly across racial groups. And to me, that is the causes are complicated. They then, as you just said, they become the cause themselves of issues in our country. But to me, that is one of the central signs that something in our country is not right.
I agree with a lot of what David said. This is not a uniquely American phenomenon at all. Economists are just starting to look into this, and you see this in Europe, you see this in South America, you see this in Middle Eastern countries. I don't think we have a real good understanding of what's driving it. When you look at the kind of nascent research on this, wealthy countries, poor countries, countries with good, strong institutions, countries without good, strong institutions, religious countries, countries that are much more secular. So I think it's a puzzle. It's a huge problem, I think. And I am inclined to agree with David that it is a vote of confidence. It is a vote of the absence of confidence in the future. But I think it's so poorly understood that I have a hard time coming to a super firm view about it.
Yes.
So I think you mentioned that lucky getting raised something that we already know the two U.S. country. And I guess it's a question for both of you. I'm just kind of curious. Like when I think about the American dream, I think about the stereotypical immigrant families. That's like my experience. The stereotypical immigrant family coming here for wealth, but I guess what does that look like for communities that have already been that are already existing in America? And what would that American dream look like in the ideal state for existing communities that face actual poverty?
I think the story you tell about immigrants is true. I mean that resonates with the evidence. That itself, I think, is a sign of the health of the American dream, that the United States continues to be a magnet for many of the hardest working, most risk tolerant, most entrepreneurial people who were born abroad. And when those people arrive here, they see rapid income growth, rapid wealth accumulation, and their kids typically do much better than they do. A lot of the studies of intergenerational mobility, that ask the question, will you go on to out-earn your parents, or will you rise in a relative income ranking? If your parents are at the 40th percentile, will you be higher than the 40th percentile? A lot of those studies exclude immigrants from the analysis sample, and so they actually miss a lot of this. But I think for native-born Americans, I think it should look similar. I think it will often be much less dramatic, because the kind of parent generation for native-born Americans will typically be much higher income and have much better education than immigrants who are coming from lower income countries with fewer educational opportunities. But fundamentally, I think the kind of basic dynamic should look quite similar in a qualitative sense.
We mostly agree on this point. If we were debating is the American dream for immigrants alive and well, I would be on the yes side of that. The trends for immigrants, as Michael just described, are extremely positive. The best book on this is called Streets of Gold by Leah Bustan and Ron Abramitsky. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his last name. For the generations of immigrants who've come here since the 1965 law, who are predominantly Asian and Latino, but not exclusively, obviously, the upward mobility looks extremely similar to the upward mobility of the predominantly Jewish and Catholic from Eastern and Southern Europe immigrants who came here in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's really a story. It's an incredibly positive story about this country. The trends that are so worrisome in the United States are for native-born Americans, and particularly those whose families go back here generations, groups that are overwhelmingly either black or white.
Let's go to a student. Yes, back there.
Thank you for the talk today. I wanted to ask both of you about what you see the role of government regulation and involvement in the economy in relation to the American dream, or whether that's a net impediment or whether that facilitates the achievement.
So before I answer that question, it reminded me to say that you guys can ask questions about anything you want to. Economic issues, the election, whatever's on your mind.
Anything the New York Times may have gotten wrong. I'm not kidding. Feel free. Michael will answer that.
I don't know that. I don't think we should have a super kind of dogmatic stance on regulation, one way or the other. I'm inclined to support less regulation rather than more. I think that there are a lot of regulatory barriers that are quite harmful to upward mobility, with no clear benefit that we should value all that much. Good examples are things like occupational licensing regulations. If you're a barber, you want to make it really hard to get a license to be a barber, because that will keep your wages high. It's kind of a classic barrier to entry in an economic sense. But unlike a brain surgeon, right? If you get a bad haircut from an unlicensed barber, it might ruin a couple weeks, but it's not going to ruin your life. And so the case for onerous occupational licensing there looks a lot like a barrier to entry and much less like a legitimate health and safety regulation. I think some regulations have shown to be very positive, like the Clean Air Act, for example, positive with respect to the health of children who then are able to earn higher incomes as adults. And then I think there are a lot of regulation. There are a lot of examples of regulation where there is a legitimate cost benefit. A hot topic right now is the cost of childcare, the cost of commercial daycare, and the Democrats want to subsidize that for people who want to put their kids in commercial daycare. Kind of a standard economic analysis would suggest that would increase the demand for commercial daycare. It's kind of tough to open commercial daycare centers, so supply is less elastic. price goes up, the subsidy actually goes to the daycares and doesn't really go to the parents. That might suggest you want to increase the supply. Part of the reason it's hard to open daycares is because there are regulations about how many infants in the infant room per adult in the infant room and this sort of stuff. And, I think more adults is better than fewer adults. So in one sense, that regulation is good. On the other hand, daycare that costs $2,000 a month in major cities is bad. And so you gotta apply a kind of normative criterion to figure that out. I think economics is an extremely powerful discipline because it can quantify these trade-offs, but it can't tell you what the right answer is. You have to apply values, and you have to apply your own normative views using that kind of empirical analysis as an input to your decision-making process. A lot of the policy debate today doesn't want to acknowledge trade-offs. Everything's a free lunch. We can take taxpayer money and buy everybody an ice cream cone, and that'll actually, make people's incomes go up 20 years later, and all this sort of stuff. And that's not, I think, the right way to think about things. So, is regulation good or bad? I think it can be both, and I think in a lot of cases it's pretty tough to come to a view on whether a specific piece of regulation is worth the cost. But less is better than more as a general rule, given where we are today.
Very briefly, my least favorite regulation in the world, and an example of how many bad regulations we have. I have to get a new prescription every year, or Warby Parker won't sell me glasses. I've been wearing glasses since 1998. My prescription has never changed. Maybe it'll change one day, but you know what? I can handle that, right? Without the government of Maryland telling me that each year I have to go get a new prescription. It's an obvious handout to optometrists, right? It's just obvious. There are a lot of other bad regulations like that. At the same time, we've clearly, I think, under-regulated the amount of carbon emissions we're putting in the air, and that's why we're living on this dangerous warming planet. I think we've clearly under-regulated social media and somehow imagined that Mark Zuckerberg has our interests and our children's interests in mind. He doesn't. He has making money in mind, and we should try to have our children's interests in mind. I think we've under-regulated companies' ability to get rid of labor unions. Even when most workers at a job site vote to form a labor union, companies have lots of ways to refuse to negotiate with them. So I think we have a whole bunch of areas where we have way too many regulations and a whole bunch of areas where we've essentially allowed people to profit off the well-being of others by having too little regulation.
Questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you both for casting this tonight to us. I'm wondering about what both of your opinions are on an expanded wealth tax to provide more resources for redistribution and elimination of poverty, various governance programs. That's a what do you think?
Michael loves it, so I think there's this interesting technocratic question about whether it's better to do a wealth tax or whether it's better just to tax high incomes a lot more, and I find that a hard debate to think about. I think wealth inequality has gotten so big in this country that I think trying to have a wealth tax would have a lot of advantages. I also acknowledge creating a new tax is fundamentally harder than dialing up the income tax. This Supreme Court is extremely friendly to wealthy interests, extremely friendly to wealthy interests. There will be a constitutional challenge about whether a wealth tax is okay. It's very easy to see the Supreme Court deciding that a wealth tax is unconstitutional. And so if we were just on kind of a whiteboard kind of way, I think a wealth tax is really interesting. I'm sympathetic to the argument that because it's so difficult, what we should be fighting for is much higher versions of the taxes we already have. Taxes on top incomes and on wealth transfers have plummeted over the last several decades in this country, and we can dial them back up. We can tax inheritances much more. We can tax top incomes much more. We can tax investments much more. And so from a day-to-day way, I just think those things are probably make more sense in the short term. But also, I think people should keep thinking about a wealth tax because in the long term, maybe that's where we should go.
I think a wealth tax is a very bad idea. Let me answer with an economic argument and then a practical argument. Though I agree with what David said about the constitutionality of it. I think that's an open question that a lot of legal scholars think it's unconstitutional. So, economics 101. If you tax something, you get less of it. So that probably means we shouldn't tax anything, except the government does a lot of stuff we want it to do. So we need to get tax revenue somewhere. And so I think the kind of best whiteboard way to think about this is, where should we get that revenue from in a way that'll do as little damage to the economy as defined with some sort of like dead weight loss criterion where people aren't producing output they otherwise would, or if you're concerned about distorting people's decisions in ways that hurt economic outcomes. And there I think from that lens, if you're taxing wealth, what you're really doing is creating a disincentive for people to save and invest. And the reason for that is that the wealth of individuals isn't kept under the mattress. It's lent to businesses, and if you want to buy a home, you're borrowing wealth from somebody, and banks are intermediaries for that. But that's where all that money comes from. And so, if you tax the return, if you tax wealth, then you're going to get less wealth. You're going to get less savings and investment, and it's investment that powers productivity gains, wage growth, income growth, and living standards over the long term. So you're reducing the wages of workers 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if you tax wealth today. Now, that may be worth it if wealth is particularly easy to tax, or if we've tapped out other sources of tax revenue. The practical argument is that wealth is very difficult to tax. Imagine that you own a dry cleaner. I don't know how much dry cleaners are worth. Imagine you own a restaurant, and that restaurant is valued at $10 million or something, and you're the owner. Right? So the IRS comes knocking on your door and says, okay, we have a 10% wealth tax. You have a $10 million asset. Please give us our $1 million. Well, you may not have $1 million to give them because you can't sell 10% of your restaurant, or it's difficult to sell 10% of your restaurant. You may not wish to sell 10% of your restaurant. You can borrow against it, but this is now creating all sorts of complications. A typical response to that is, well, we should just tax stock market wealth because that can be more easily converted into income. But then you're introducing a really harmful distortion into the economy where wealthy individuals will no longer put their wealth into assets that can easily be converted into a liquid asset, and instead they'll just buy like paintings. So you buy a $20 million painting. You certainly can't give the IRS 10% of that painting. So you get all sorts of problems like this. David mentioned that we don't appropriately regulate carbon, and carbon's a great place to look for tax revenue. I'd support taxing carbon emissions enthusiastically before I would support taxing wealth. I would support taxing consumption enthusiastically before I started taxing wealth. And I would be happy to raise taxes on say the top half of the income distribution before I wanted to tax wealth.
All right, we're getting a little tight on time, so I want to keep maybe the answers a little bit shorter.
Yes, sir.
The questions are just so good.
So thank you both for your work on this important topic. I want to build on the last couple of questions and ask you more generally how we can do better. You both think that we and the country can do better. Sort of views about just how horrendous our current state is, but what can we do to do better? And I think it goes beyond taxing, it goes beyond just a matter of tax rates. goes beyond how we treat optometrists. It's, I think, something bigger. You, Michael, particularly, the subtitle of your book is explicitly worried that bad policies will come from a misdiagnosis.
Yep.
David, your book finishes with some policy views. You say a little about what you would do for the country to do better.
So actually, can I borrow Michael's book? So one of my kids said, when I brought this home, one of my kids said, "Dad, this is like your book, except your book is the American dream is dead, but populism could revive it." And so that's actually a version of the answer to Doug's question. To me, I know people define populism in different ways. To me, a big part of the problem is that both of our political parties have in large ways been disdainful of working class people. So if you want to define that as the 2/3 of the population who don't have a college degree. I think the Republican Party has continued to follow an economic policy that just doesn't work, right? We're going to cut taxes on rich people and that's going to work out well for everyone. We've been doing that since the 1980s. It hasn't worked out. Deregulation hasn't worked out. Getting rid of labor unions hasn't worked out. Much expanded trade hasn't worked out. Much expanded immigration hasn't worked out. We'll come back to immigration. And so the Republican Party has basically followed this sort of model of let's just get rid of government and things will work out great for people. You heard the statistics from me. Things haven't worked out great for most Americans. They've worked out pretty well for wealthy Americans, but they haven't worked out really well for most Americans. And so I think the Republican Party, Donald Trump was able to take over the Republican Party because he basically understood that a lot of Republican voters were sick of this recipe. The Democrats have had a different issue. Yes, the Democrats' economic policy, I believe, is mostly more helpful to working class people. But Democrats have been really disdainful of working class people in a whole bunch of ways. They've told them they're ignorant. They've told them they're hateful. In 2016, they said the only reason people voted for Donald Trump is because they were racist. And then what's happened over the last 5 years? Growing numbers of Black, Latino, and Asian voters have drifted away from the Democratic Party. So it seems like that old idea that you just really, like if you don't like the Democrats, you're racist and ignorant, looks kind of problematic today. And I think on a whole set of issues, the Democratic Party has basically told working people that their values in terms of religion, in terms of their desire not to have really high immigration, a view that extends across working class of all races. I would encourage you to watch some of the town hall meetings in communities where people are worried about the immigration of the last few years and look at the procession of people coming to the microphone to say this has to stop. It is a multiracial group of people who are saying it has to stop. So I was told I need to be shorter, but to me, a world in which our two parties took more seriously the interests and the values of people who don't read the New York Times and go to Dartmouth would be a step toward reinvigorating the American dream.
A stronger emphasis on economic growth, less regulation, lower corporate taxes, lower capital taxes, more investment in scientific research to support innovation, reduction of the type of labor market barriers I mentioned, big push on policies to encourage participation in economic life, big expansion of earning subsidies, for example, big expansion of training programs for non-college educated Americans, where I think we finally started to crack the code on that over the last 10 years.
Question here, yes.
Way more immigrants, big increases in immigration.
That second to last question. If you had, say, a button or a magic wand in front of you, what would be the chief policy or action you would take to revive or bolster?
What's the best single policy? I'll go first while you think. This isn't a magic button, but it's something that I think gets too little attention. I just alluded to it. I think labor unions are really important. I've been in a labor union. I found it frustrating at times. I'm now a manager who manages people in a labor union. I get that labor unions are imperfect. They're imperfect. You know what else are imperfect? Corporations. And when you have corporations unchecked by labor unions, it ends up being particularly bad for people who don't have a lot of skills in a kind of globalized sense, who don't have college degrees. And really, if you look at the chart, it's another chart from my book, if you look at the chart of inequality and labor unions in this country, they move in almost exactly opposite directions. And I think making it easier for people who want to join labor unions to actually do so and bargain collectively has been shown time and again to lift the wages of most people.
Like a big increase in highly skilled immigrants would be, if I had one magic button, it'd be that button. I'm not allowed to fire Congress, I suppose.
Okay, I'll make it quick. So, should we be looking at, when we think about this question, like, does the American dream hold? Should we look at the average American, the people who are worst off, or the gap between the best off and the worst off? I've heard all these perspectives here, and I'm curious what you think is the most important one, without saying all of them.
Maybe surprisingly, I would argue that I think the gap is the least important. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but to me, if we were in a situation where for the median American and the American at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, if things were going really well, but they were still losing ground to the rich, then I would say, maybe it's just the price of living in a highly dynamic society. We get increasing inequality, but everyone's doing really well. That's not what's been happening. What's been happening is that income growth for the vast majority of the population has been weaker than it was in the late 20th century, and income growth at the very top has been much, much stronger than it was. And so to me, it's some version of your first two, which is I want to know what's going on at the middle, and I also want to know what's going on at the bottom. The gap I care less about.
I agree with that. I care very little about the gap. Income inequality was rising a lot in the 1990s. Nobody cared at all. There are a lot of different ways to measure inequality, but if you take the Congressional Budget Office's measure, you see that since 2008 or so, inequality has either stagnated or actually declined and given back a lot of the increases that it experienced in the 80s and 90s. And that stagnation or reduction in inequality doesn't seem to be making people happy. I think we should care most about the folks at the bottom, just as a normative matter. I think when trying to, and for policy, I think policymakers, that's where their focus should be. I think when trying to assess the health of the American dream, I think you've got to look at the whole thing, just analytically. But I wouldn't focus much on inequality.
Okay, it's 3 hands. 1, 2, and 3. Unfortunately, not you, Bernie. Someone behind you. Yes, go ahead.
So my question was hearing.
Speak up, please, so we can help you.
Oh, okay, sorry. So on both sides, I heard really strong statistics. First about income growth being really slow for the majority of Americans, and then a lot of statistics about like a lot of real wage growth like increases. What would each of you guys say is like the missing piece from the other statistics? Because it seems hard for both of you.
That's a great question. So I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I was actually taking a couple notes about this. So when Micah was giving income statistics, he said a couple times, including taxes and transfers, right? And so it's kind of not what you would expect based on sort of our political profile. Micah was ignoring the long-term budget deficit, right? Because some of the income growth has come through government benefits that we've given people that we haven't paid for. I was talking about private sector. I was talking about wages, not private. I was talking about straight on income that you get from your employer, whereas he was including government benefits a couple different times. I'm not saying that's the full thing, right? And so if you include government benefits, the picture looks a little bit better. I have a hard time getting excited about that because we're really not paying for that, right?
He's kind of an anti-government guy.
Yes. And then the other thing I noticed is Michael talked about wages a couple times, and I was talking about household income. And so one of the things that I would argue that wages exclude are people who've dropped out of the labor force, who aren't in the labor force. And if you're just looking at average wages over time, people who don't have any wages no longer count, right? So this is a little bit technical. But we've had a real increase in men who have dropped out of the labor force over the last few decades. And so I think the wage statistics exaggerates how good things are. And the reason men have dropped out of the labor force are there are a lot more men locked up in prison than there used to be, and so they just don't even count. They're just taken out of the equation. And there are a whole bunch of men classically in the sort of in blue-collar economy who no longer are working. Maybe they're on disability. I'm not saying that explains the entire thing. We're probably pulling different statistics. But those are two things I note. I was sitting there thinking, people must find this confusing. And I was sitting there thinking, I think those are two things that help explain some of the difference. I'm not even saying most of the difference.
So I think the answer is different, and I'm going to draw on the board. Because this is a pervasive issue in academics. So this is time, okay? And that is inflation-adjusted wages. A lot of growth, until 1973. Big oil shock. Nominal wages are still growing. Inflation takes off. Then things look kind of bad until like 1993. Then things take off again. A lot of the statistics you see by economists in academic publications and in the newspaper start their comparison in 1973. A lot of them start their comparison in 1979. And your growth statistic really matters, is really affected by where you start. When I look at this, what I see is the post-war boom. Then I see a big inflationary shock that took us, a decade to figure out how to deal with. That inflation was eroding nominal wage gains, kind of kept eroding them. Then all of a sudden, in the early 90s, we balanced the budget. The economy really starts growing. We have a tech boom, and expectations about future inflation are firmly anchored, and inflation is no longer an issue, and things take off. So, I see kind of three distinct regimes. If you were an economist writing in the year 1993, if you were James Carville, it's the economy, stupid, you were empirically supported. If we were having this debate in 1993, I would have said that wages had been stagnant for decades, because wages had been stagnant for decades. If you're, an economist in, 2000, right? Maybe you think like, this is the norm and this is the blip. But 1993 was 31 years ago. And I think we're kind of in this new normal period. And the big reason is better monetary policy. And therefore, a lot of what I do kind of starts with the business cycle peak when we enter this new regime. But the question of what year do you start at when you're making these calculations is a really important one. And not a lot of thought goes into it. And people kind of reflexively pick 1973 or 1979.
Just very briefly.
I'm not saying David does that.
You've gotten to the heart of a part of our disagreement. I don't think incomes for most Americans look like this line, and Michael does. And so we would encourage all of you to go out and take a look and decide which one you think it's closer to, right?
So select two questions, and we'll get two lightning answers. Yes, right here.
So I like the question you asked about anyone who lived in the 70s and everything would want to go back to the
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, is there a false attribution to capitalism to the better racial and gender relationships? Because capitalism was still there 10 years before the 70s when Jim Crow was just coming to an end. So I'd like to hear what your opinion is about what capitalism has done in that regard. And feel free to also talk about your opinions on reparations.
I'll make this very quick because he's in our class and we can go into this more.
Okay.
Okay, great. I would say capitalism in the narrow way has really failed to deliver racial progress over the last several decades. The black-white pay gap is only slightly smaller in this country today than it was when Harry Truman was president. Once you take into account how many black men are in jail. When you don't do that, it looks a lot better than when you actually take into account how many black men we've locked up in this country. And so in the very narrow way, I would say capitalism has failed to deliver racial progress that it should have. I still think capitalism is the best system we have. I just think it's not the version of capitalism we've been pursuing.
So I think you're absolutely right that to say we had capitalism before, we had capitalism after, how could it be capitalism? And I don't think the advances in civil rights were in the vast majority about capitalism. Martin Luther King wasn't about capitalism, but the civil rights movement was heavily about jobs and opportunity, and that's been forgotten. That was the actual name of the March on Washington, for example. But I think if you kind of zoom out and look at the broad sweep of history, nothing is better for race relations. Nothing is better for good relations between people of different religious faiths than economic growth and a commercial society.
And also read what Martin Luther King said about labor unions. Seriously.
No one's right about everything.
Yeah,
David, that you've written persuasively on immigration, and especially that there is a long kind of progressive tradition underlying a certain kind of view about it that praises its benefits. Tight labor market should benefit lower income workers. Also, there has to be a kind of reasonable policy with border security. How much of that perspective do you think is being appreciated by the Democratic Party and kind of the establishment Democrats today? Do you think there's any staying power in the arguments that you're making?
Thank you. I don't think I'm the one who shifted it, but the chapter I was most nervous about of my book, and the one that I'm most pleased with, is chapter 9. It's the immigration chapter. If you all have a chance to read any part of the book, and you don't have time for the whole thing, I would suggest reading that. I was most nervous about it because I was somewhat more critical about immigration than a lot of progressives are. I said it's not the free lunch that progressives try to claim that it is. I think what we saw was, for a long time, you had progressives in this country who were both pro-immigrant without always being in favor of more immigration. Bernie Sanders said there's a reason why CEOs are in favor of such high immigration, and it's not their concern for the poor of the world, it's that they want to keep wages down. Right? There's a long tradition of civil rights leaders and labor leaders saying, hey, we can't have too much immigration. It's bad for the Americans who are the most vulnerable ones. Barack Obama embodied this. Go listen to what he said about immigration. Bernie Sanders embodied this. Barbara Jordan, who's a figure in my book, embodied it. And then the Democratic Party of the last decade basically kind of threw that out. And they just said, whatever we can do to reduce the amount of border security we have, whatever we can do to admit more people is what we're going to do. The 2020 Democratic platform had not a word about border security. It was all about making it easier to enter this country, whether you have legal permission or not. That was never in tune with what most voters wanted. It was never in tune with what most Democratic voters wanted. And what you've seen with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden over the last year is a return to where public opinion actually is. It could still cost them the election. And so it's been an incredibly damaging turn that the Democratic Party took in political terms. The people who've been admitted to this country, it will bring great benefits to them personally, but we live in a democracy. And Democrats spend a lot of time accusing the other side of being anti-democratic. Ignoring public opinion about immigration is something the Democratic Party has done that has been anti-democratic. And I'm heartened to see that they are now being more respectful of what the American voters want.
40 seconds. I'm tempted to make a joke about this and say I'm disappointed to see the Democrats being respectful of what the American people want about this. But I am a little bit disappointed by that. I mean, look, I think we had a great deal in the Senate that addressed border security, and President Trump blew that up in order to keep this issue alive during the election, and that's just a fact of the historical record. The common sense solution here is obvious. Clearly, we need a secure border, and clearly we need greater immigration inflows, and to be completely serious, I mean, I agree with David that Americans don't seem to want that. If I were in the Senate, I would substitute my judgment for theirs on this, and I suspect that's what will happen, but we'll see.
And the only way to get Americans to agree to more legal immigration, which I do think you can get them to agree to, is to have real border security.
Yes.
And it's totally possible. The Biden administration just proved it. They cracked down on it, and immigration plummeted. Yeah. It's totally possible.
Last question, Professor Avishai. Very short answers each, if you can. That's the last question.
Maybe a little late to be raising this, but can I put in a plug for the 60s and 70s?
Maybe for the 60s.
I have Newsweeks on my night table from the 60s and 70s, and the level of public discourse was infinitely higher than it is today. The kinds of things that you could say in public were far more, let's say, alert to the shame of saying something idiotic than what you've said today. And I think what hasn't been addressed yet, and I think speaks to the kind of panic people have about the election this year, is that there are tens of millions of people who seem to be, let's say, oblivious to the question of whether or not what you say in public, not just whether it's true, but whether truth even exists. And I feel like we're not dealing with this. this. We seem to be talking about the American dream purely in terms of the stomach and not in terms of the mind. And if John Stuart Mill were here right now, a little plug for the political economy project, if John Stuart Mill were here right now, he'd be a little, miffed.
Sounds like a statement, not a question. Thank you both for your very kind words about Dartmouth, about debate. Thank you all very much for coming. Let's greet them with a